Hello and welcome to chapter 5 of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. Um, just to have a little recap from the previous chapter then, if you remember chapter 4, which was the Carew murder case, began a year later than the last lot of events that we'd seen involving Dr. Jekyll and the Utterson's concern about the will and the story that Utterson had heard about the little girl being trampled by Mr. Hyde. So we have moved forward a little more in the story. So we've had the Carew murder case. If you remember, Danvers Carew was an MP. He was an elderly gentleman, had very, very good reputation, and very well respected by people. The murder, if you recall, was described in really quite brutal terms. The fact that he was basically clubbed to death in the middle of the street for no reason that anyone can determine. The fact that there was money in a gold pocket watch that were left on the body suggested it wasn't a robbery. And the fact that the maid that witnessed it, who gave the statement to the police, suggested that the conversation that the two gentlemen had underneath her window where she was watching didn't seem to be anything of concern to her. So the attack was very much unprovoked. It was very out of the blue. It was very unpredictable. And if you recall, I said last time that perhaps one of the reasons why the attack was so brutal was because we find out later in the novel that Dr. Jekyll had stopped himself from becoming Edward Hyde for quite some months. So when he did eventually become Edward Hyde once again, it was almost as though Hyde had grown in violence, in aggression, because he'd been sort of caged up. I think he later described himself as being like a caged animal. And so when he came out of that cage, in other words, out of the body of Jekyll, the violence was unprecedented. It was far, far worse than we'd seen, anything we've seen from him before. So we'd left it then with, if you recall, with Mr. Utterson going with the police to the address in Soho, which Edward Hyde had given to Utterson on the brief time that they met. Utterson believed that he'd given him the address so that he would know where to contact him in the event of Jekyll's death, so that he could then benefit from the will. And this is how Utterson has the address to be able to go around there. And if you recall, he goes into the apartments, into the lodgings where he's staying. The rooms are furnished particularly well. There's a real element of luxury that Stevenson describes. However, the room has been ransacked, so the drawers have been pulled out. It seems that somebody's been there in a hurry. We know that must have been Hyde, obviously, after the murder of Carew. We discovered the second half of the cane, the first half of the walking cane being next to Danvers Carew's body. And the second half is hidden behind the door in these rooms, which makes it pretty much an open shut case in terms of the guilt of Edward Hyde. They also found several things that had been burnt in the fireplace, one of which was a checkbook. And if you remember, I said to you that means that Edward Hyde would have no way of getting any money, no means of getting money. They didn't have cash machines, obviously, back in these times. You couldn't just go into any bank and get your money out in the way that you can do today. You'd have to go back. You'd have to actually go into the branch where your money was held to be able to get your money back. So they kind of believe that this is going to be quite easy to be able to catch Edward Hyde, because nobody can really survive without money. So all they think they've got to do is go to the bank and wait for him there. But of course, he doesn't really turn up, because we know it's because he's both Jekyll and Hyde. So we're moving to chapter 5 then. It's a fairly short chapter. It's about 3.5 pages long. And it's called Incident of the Letter. Now, the fact that we have the word incident suggests something quite significant, quite dramatic, and the fact that there is something concerning a letter. So given that the chapter names that Stevenson chooses, all of them point towards something significant in that chapter, and we know that there is going to be something important about this particular letter, whatever that letter may be. And if you recall, the one thing that was found on the body of Danvers Carew was a letter that was addressed to Mr. Utterson himself, and that was how Utterson became involved in the murder of Danvers Carew and the police investigation. So, incident of the letter. It was late in the afternoon when Mr. Utterson found his way to Dr. Jekyll's door, where he was at once admitted by pull and carried down by the kitchen offices and across a yard which had once been a garden, to the building which was indifferently known as the laboratory or the dissecting rooms. The doctor, this is Dr. Jekyll, so this is Dr. Jekyll's house. The doctor had bought the house from the heirs of a celebrated surgeon, and his own tastes being rather chemical than anatomical, had changed the destination of the block at the bottom of the garden. Now, you might remember in one of the early videos I talked about the back part of Dr. Jekyll's house. Where there's a door that goes to and from the back part of the house onto the back street, and that's the door that Utterson and Enfield talk about in the first chapter. This talks about the history of the house, the fact that one of the previous owners was a celebrated surgeon. In other words, he was a surgeon, a doctor of some quite high reputation. And it said that when Jekyll bought the house, his own tastes were chemical than anatomical. In other words, Dr. Jekyll is into chemistry as a doctor rather than anatomy, which would be biology and the human form. And this Stevenson tells us that he changed the destination of the block at the bottom of the garden. And if you recall, I said to you that one of the previous owners, this celebrated surgeon, would have used it as a teaching room. So there would have been they referred to it as a theatre. A theatre, that the term theatre we know today to mean where you put plays and things on, but a theatre is just a Greek word that just means viewing space. And so this will be a viewing space where young up-and-coming doctors and surgeons would watch the previous owner, this celebrated surgeon, perhaps perform autopsies where they would open up dead bodies for them to actually view where the heart and the lungs and the different organs of the body were situated, and what could be done about those if there was disease, or how to recognise disease and that sort of thing. So it's talking about the previous owner of the house and the way that the house has perhaps changed over time. But essentially, we have in the current state with Dr. Jekyll as owner, we have the big part of the front part of the house, which is where the main living quarters are, where the kitchens are, where Dr. Jekyll's bedroom is, where, if you recall, in chapter 2, sorry, the end of chapter 2, it was where Utterson went to try and speak to Jekyll, but he wasn't at home, and he was admitted by Paul, and it had the big fireplace and this beautiful grand hall. So as you come out through the house, there would be an outside space that perhaps then had, it's referred to as a cupola in the novel, and a cupola is a glass domed roof, and this would perhaps be where there would be a lower floor part in the centre, and then perhaps raised steps around the outside, which would be where the viewing space, a theatre, would be, where the previous doctor of the house would do his experiments. After there's a small flight of steps that goes up to a baize door. Baize is another word for a thick felt, so a thick felted door, material covered door that goes into the laboratory at the back. And the laboratory, or the cabinet, as it's sometimes referred to in the novel, this is where Dr. Jekyll does all of his own experimentation. Okay, so we talk about him as a doctor. He's a doctor of chemistry, as opposed to a doctor of anatomy, which is what the previous owner of the house would have been. It was the first time that the lawyer had been received in that part of his friend's quarters, and he eyed the dingy, windowless structure with curiosity, and gazed round with a distasteful sense of strangeness as he crossed the theatre, once crowded with eager students, and now lying gaunt and silent, the tables laden with chemical apparatus, the floor strewn with crates and littered with packing straw, and the light falling dimly through the foggy cupola. At the further end, a flight of stairs mounted to a door covered with red baize, and through this Mr. Utterson was at last received into the doctor's cabinet. So look at the language that Stevenson uses here. He talks about that once it would have been crowded with eager students, and now it lies gaunt and silent. Gaunt just means quite unlived in. There's an emptiness, a sallowness to it. We've got words like dimly, we've got foggy. There's an air of kind of abandonment of this particular part of Dr. Jekyll's house that links the front part of the house where guests are received, and the fancy part of the house to the back part of the house, which is Dr. Jekyll's private quarters, where he does all of his experimentation. Okay, and it seems that there's a sense of separation between the two. I've talked previously about the way that the house is a metaphor for Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, with the front part, the fancy part that is shown to the world at the front, which represents Dr. Jekyll, and then this very hidden, dark side at the back of the house, which is a metaphor for Edward Hyde himself. It was a large room, fitted round with glass presses, furnished among other things with a cheval glass and a business table, and looking out upon the court by 3 dusty windows barred with iron. And even look at the language there, the fact the windows are barred with iron, this suggests an element of secrecy. It talks about the things that are in the room. It talks about a cheval glass. Now, a cheval glass is one of those tall mirrors that you have, you might have at home, that you can actually sort of swing to uh, different angles so that tall people can see it when it's pushed backwards, and then shorter people can see themselves in it full length when it's pushed forward. And this would be quite an unusual thing, a cheval glass, for a gentleman to have in his working rooms, in his business rooms, because it suggests an element of vanity that we wouldn't normally associate with a Victorian gentleman in his working environment. Okay, we find out later in chapter 10 that Jekyll put it there for when he does the transformations into Hyde, so he can see himself in the clothes. And it also suggests that he's able to tip it forward to look at himself when he's shorter as Edward Hyde, or tip it back to look at his full height when he's Dr. Jekyll. Okay. The fire burned in the grate. A lamp was set lighted on the chimney shelf. For even in the houses the fog began to lie thick, and there, close up to the warmth, sat Dr. Jekyll, looking deadly sick. He did not rise to meet his visitor, but held out a cold hand and bade him welcome in a changed voice. So the fact that we have here, we have the fire that burned in the grate and a lamp was lighted. The fire and the light suggest an element of hope. If you think about the poem A Wife in London, it's probably very much round about the time that this book was written. Um, and we see a very similar type of description of London, with the fog coming in through the houses. We have this kind of post-industrialisation darkness that shrouds London. And the fact that we've got Dr. Jekyll, who's close up to the warmth, suggests that he's trying to almost grasp onto any element of hope. But look at the descriptions here by Stevenson, where it talks about the fact that he was looking deadly sick. He didn't rise to meet his visitor, so he didn't actually stand up to greet Utterson, which would be quite unusual for a gentleman. They would normally sort of stand to rise and shake their hands and bid them welcome, but he doesn't, which suggests that there's something really quite physically quite bad about Jekyll at this point. It says that he held out a cold hand and bade him welcome in a changed voice. So there's a very different side of Henry Jekyll that we're seeing here. If you recall, the only other time that we've seen Jekyll ourselves in the book was in chapter 3, when he had the dinner party, and it talks about this very boisterous, very kind of warm and genial manner about him, and yet here there's a very distinct change in him. And of course, Utterson and the readers at the time, or readers that were unfamiliar with the ending of the story, wouldn't know why he'd changed so much. We, as a modern reader, because we understand that Jekyll and Hyde are one and the same person, we know that this will probably be Henry Jekyll's reaction to the murder that he committed when he was Edward Hyde, the murder of Danvers Carew. "And now," said Mr. Utterson, as soon as Poole had left him, "you've heard the news?" The doctor shuddered. "They were crying it in the square," he said. "I heard them in my dining room." Crying it in the square would be the newsboys. There'd be newspaper sellers, young boys that would go around the streets, and they would sort of cry out about the main headlines to entice people into to buy the newspapers. They obviously had none of the social media or the internet that we have these days, so this is the way that important news would be distributed, because you'd have these young newspaper boys going around the streets crying out the main headlines. "One word," said the lawyer. "Carew was my client, but so are you, and I want to know what I'm doing. You have not been mad enough to hide this fellow." The fellow that he's talking about here, of course, is Edward Hyde, and it's very, very ironic, the language that Utterson uses here when he says you have not been mad enough to hide this fellow. So Utterson is here to visit Jekyll because, of course, this is straight after the murder of Danvers Carew, and he strongly suspects Jekyll's involvement, perhaps through Hyde, or he's very concerned that perhaps Jekyll has hidden Edward Hyde, who is now a murderer, a wanted murderer. "Utterson, I swear to God," cried the doctor, "I swear to God I will never set eyes on him again. I bind my honour to you that I am done with him in this world. It is all at an end, and indeed he does not want my help. You do not know him as I do. He is safe. He is quite safe, mark my words. He will never more be heard of." Now, the assurance that Dr. Jekyll gives to Utterson there, of course, knowing what we know about the fact that they are one and the same person, and he's able to turn into Hyde whenever he chooses, suggests that he's definite. He's able to be so definite in this because he, by saying to him, "It is all at an end," that I will never set eyes on him again. Jekyll knows in his own mind that he's able to make that assurance because he just simply won't take the potion again. It's worth noting here, though, that as knowing what we know about him actually as Jekyll and as Hyde, he's a murderer because he's the same person. He does not attempt here to admit any part in the deed. He doesn't attempt to confess. And we have to wonder as to how honest a man Dr. Jekyll is here. He's actually taking quite the cowardly route out here by choosing not to admit the truth. So in other words, he's able to hide himself now as a murderer, and essentially is able to get away with murdering somebody in cold blood, a very innocent victim in an unprovoked attack. The lawyer listened gloomily. He did not like his friend's feverish manner. Feverish just means quite hot-headed, so it seems as though Jekyll is acting perhaps out of character, a little bit exaggerated, a little bit dramatic. "You seem pretty sure of him," said he, "and for your sake I hope you may be right. If it came to a trial, your name might appear." "I'm quite sure of him," replied Jekyll. "I have grounds for certainty that I cannot share with anyone. But there is one thing on which you may advise me. I have received a letter, and I'm at a loss whether I should show it to the police. I should like to leave it in your hands, Utterson. You would judge wisely, I am sure. I have so great a trust in you." Utterson mentions here that if it came to a trial, your name might appear. There is almost like a hidden threat here from Utterson with regards to Jekyll's reputation. So Utterson, as a lawyer and as a friend of Jekyll, gives him the opportunity here to confess to any involvement that he might have, either in the murder itself or in hiding Edward Hyde. And then Jekyll kind of comes back, retorts with the fact that he's received a letter, that he is worried about giving it to the police, and therefore he gives it to Utterson to judge what he should do with it. "You fear, I suppose, that it might lead to his detection?" asked the lawyer. "No," said the other. "I cannot say that I care what becomes of Hyde. I'm quite done with him. I was thinking of my own character, which this hateful business has rather exposed." And we come down once again to the idea of reputation, where he fears that his own character, his own reputation, has been exposed. He's been put on out on public view because of his involvement with Hyde. Utterson ruminated a while. He was surprised at his friend's selfishness, and yet relieved by it. "Well," said he at last, "let me see the letter." The letter was written in an odd upright hand. Hand means handwriting, and signed Edward Hyde. And it signified, briefly enough, that the writer's benefactor, Dr. Jekyll, whom he had long so unworthily repaid for 1,000 generosities, need labour under no alarm for his safety, as he had means of escape on which he placed a sure dependence. The lawyer liked this letter well enough. It put a better colour on the intimacy than he had looked for, and he blamed himself for some of his past suspicions. So that paragraph there, it seems quite wordy, it seems quite complex, but it basically paraphrases, so it puts into very simple terms the contents of the letter. So the letter is one that was written by Edward Hyde and given to Jekyll, apparently, and in it says that that Dr. Jekyll need labour under no alarm for his safety, and he had means of escape on which he placed a sure dependence. In other words, the letter is assuring Dr. Jekyll that Mr. Hyde has made his escape and that there is no chance of him being discovered, being found. Now, Utterson kind of takes some. He says that he liked the letter well enough because it put a better colour on the intimacy. In other words, it reassures Utterson here that perhaps Jekyll and Hyde have cut all ties forever. Now, as a modern reader, knowing what we know about the fact that Jekyll and Hyde are one and the same person, this throws up a slightly unusual quandary, because we are wondering why Edward Hyde has written to Dr. Jekyll. It's the same person. Now, Utterson obviously not knowing this suggests that Dr. Jekyll has written this letter as a means of throwing Mr. Utterson off the scent, to try and stop him being suspicious of Edward Hyde's whereabouts. In other words, Dr. Jekyll is providing himself with a very good alibi. Okay. Now, the one thing that we find out later is that as well as having memory in common when they are jumped between Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, the only other thing that they have in common is their handwriting. Okay, and we find out later that Dr. Jekyll's normal handwriting, when he writes as Edward Hyde, he simply slopes it in the opposite direction. Okay, so whereby I think he writes with a right-handed slope as Dr. Jekyll, he then changed it to a left-handed slope as Edward Hyde. Okay, but of course Utterson does not know this, and we only find this out as a first-time reader much later on in the book. Okay, have you the envelope? Utterson asked. I burned it, replied Jekyll, before I thought what I was about. But it bore no postmark. The note was handed in. Shall I keep this and sleep upon it? Asked Utterson. I wish you to judge for me entirely, was the reply. I've lost confidence in myself. So at this point then, Jekyll seems to give complete sort of control of the proceedings here to Utterson, because he says that he trusts him completely. Knowing what we know about this letter, though, we know that this is just actually a very, very good con by Dr. Jekyll to reassure Utterson that that Hyde will not return, and therefore putting Jekyll past any sort of blame or association with Hyde. Well, I shall consider, returned the lawyer. And now one word more. It was Hyde who dictated the terms of your will about that disappearance. The doctor seemed seized with a qualm of faintness. He shut his mouth tight and nodded. I knew it, said Utterson. He meant to murder you. You've had a fine escape. I've had what is far more to the purpose, returned the doctor solemnly. I've had a lesson. Oh God, Utterson, what a lesson I have had. And he covered his face for a moment with his hands. So once he's been given the letter, Utterson's final question here is about whether or not it was Hyde that dictated the terms of Jekyll's will. In other words, Utterson is asking Jekyll whether or not the will was a form of blackmail by Edward Hyde. In other words, if you disappear or if you die, Edward Hyde receives everything in your will. Okay, and look at the doctor's response. It says that he was seized with a qualm of faintness. He shut his mouth tight and nodded. So Dr. Jekyll once again is able to take Utterson's presumptions about the will and twist them round to make himself seem entirely innocent. So as a modern reader, we could perhaps lose quite a lot of respect and time really for Dr. Jekyll on this, because he's absolutely refusing to take any part and take any responsibility. He's acting as a coward, quite honestly, here. But look at the irony of his words there in the last part, his last comments there to Utterson, where he says, I have had a lesson. So in other words, he's been taught a lesson. Now we know later on that the lesson he's been taught is that he can never become Edward Hyde again, that he shouldn't have meddled in science, he shouldn't have meddled in this dual nature of man, tried to split the two parts of his brain, his personality. On his way out, the lawyer stopped and had a word or two with Poole. By the by, said Utterson, there was a letter handed in today. What was the messenger like? But Poole was positive that nothing had come except by post, and only circulars by that, he added. Circulars is just a word that we would use today for junk mail, I suppose. So Utterson is asking here, Poole, who it was that delivered the letter that Jekyll has just showed him. Now we know that there was no one that delivered the letter, because Jekyll wrote the letter himself and has given it to Utterson. So when Utterson asked him to look at the envelope, and Dr. Jekyll said he burnt it before he thought about the letter, we know that that's another. We know later on that that's another lie, because there was no envelope, because it wasn't delivered. But what this does for Utterson, it makes him concerned again, not suspicious of Jekyll. He's concerned again as to how that letter came to Dr. Jekyll, and he begins to make assumptions, as we see here. This news sent off Utterson with his fears renewed. Plainly, the letter had come by the laboratory door. Possibly, indeed, it had been written in the cabinet. And if that was so, it must be differently judged and handled with more caution. So Utterson's first belief then, when he learns that the letter must have come by hand, but it wasn't handed in by the front of the house, is he believes it must have been delivered directly to the cabinet, which puts Dr. Jekyll in more danger, because it suggests that Hyde has direct access to and from the cabinet. We know, of course, that he had a key. It also makes Utterson more concerned, because he's wondering whether or not the letter was actually written in the cabinet itself by Mr. Hyde in front of Jekyll. The newsboys, as he went, were crying themselves hoarse along the footways. Special edition, shocking murder of an MP. That was a funeral oration of one friend and client, and he couldn't help a certain apprehension lest the good name of another should be sucked down in the eddy of the scandal. So that bit there basically means that he's the first friend and client that he refers to, of course, is Danvers Carew, and the fact that he's been murdered because he's been caught up with Edward Hyde, even if it was just a passing him in the street. Utterson's second concern then becomes a certain apprehension in case the good name of another friend, in other words, Dr. Jekyll, be drawn down in the eddy of the scandal. In other words, he's concerned that he's going to lose a second friend in this scandal surrounding Hyde, and the second friend that he's concerned about, of course, Dr. It was at least a ticklish decision that he had to make, and self-reliant as he was by habit, he began to cherish a longing for advice. It was not to be had directly, but perhaps he thought it might be fished for. So in other words, he wants a second opinion on the letter here from somebody else. Presently after, he sat on one side of his own hearth, and the hearth is another word for the fireplace. He sat on one side of his hearth with Mr. Guest, his head clerk, upon the other, and midway between them, at a nicely calculated distance from the fire, a bottle of a particular old wine that had long dwelt unsunned in the foundation of his house. So we have a new character here that is introduced here, only very briefly. It's another functional character or pivotal character in the same way that we saw with Enfield. And this character here is somebody called Mr. Guest, who is head clerk to Mr. Utterson, and your clerk would be somebody that you would work with in a business sense. So it's not like Paul is with Dr. Jekyll, where it's kind of in a personal, domestic household sense. This is somebody in a business sense, and they're sitting either side of the fire. They've opened up a very old vintage bottle of wine, which suggests that the two of them are quite amiable, quite good friends. Somebody who Utterson trusts, and it's him that is about to show the letter to ask for advice. The fog still slept on the wing above the drowned city, where the lamps glimmered like carbuncles. And through the muffle and smother of these fallen clouds, the procession of the town's life was still rolling in through the great arteries with a sound as of a mighty wind. So it's talking about the external setting here. Outside of Utterson's house, we've got the fog. It talks about the drowned city. There's a real sense of negativity. But Stevenson goes on to juxtapose that with the warmth and the friendly feeling that's inside the room with Utterson and Guest. But the room was gay with firelight. In the bottle, the acids were long ago resolved. The imperial dye had softened with time, as the colour grows richer in stained windows, and the glow of hot autumn afternoons on hillside vineyards was ready to be set free and to disperse the fogs of London. So that's just a description of the bottle of wine. There's nothing much to say about that other than it's juxtaposing the coldness and the fogginess of autumn London with the wine that would have perhaps have been made out in some vineyard, perhaps out in Italy, and the warmth and richness that wine therefore offers in juxtaposition. Insensibly, the lawyer melted. There was no man from whom he kept fewer secrets than Mr. Guest, and he was not always sure that he kept as many as he meant. Where it says the lawyer melted, it just suggests that Mr. Utterson is relaxed, so that the wine and the warmth and the good company have relaxed his fears that he's just brought back from Jekyll's house. Guest had often been on business to the doctor's, that's to Dr. Jekyll's. He knew Poole. He could scarce have failed to hear of Mr. Hyde's familiarity about the house. He might draw conclusions. Was it not as well, then, that he should see a letter which put that mystery to rights? This is kind of Utterson in his head here, debating whether or not he should talk to Mr. Guest about his fears. But he he calms himself and justifies himself by saying that Guest will probably have heard about Hyde. He knew Dr. Jekyll. He was familiar at his house, and he was a good friend of Utterson. So this is Utterson debating whether or not he should talk to Guest about this, because it might damage Jekyll's reputation. But he reassures himself that Guest knows enough about the events for him to talk about this in confidence and to trust Guest's judgment. And above all, since Guest, being a great student and critic of handwriting, would consider the step natural and obliging. The clerk beside was a man of counsel. He would scarce read so strange a document without dropping a remark, and to that remark Mr. Utterson might shape his future course. So the other way that Utterson reassures himself that it's okay for him to talk about to Guest about this is the fact that he said he was a man of counsel. A man of counsel means that he's quite a wise man who gives very good advice. And an important factor here is that Guest is a student and critic of handwriting. In other words, he's someone that's studied handwriting. This is an art that we don't really see very much in modern times. But the Victorians in particular were quite, some people would get quite obsessed with handwriting. They would study handwriting. It's something that we call today graphology, and it's the study of people's handwriting. And it's believed that you can tell quite a lot about somebody by the way that they write. So Guest not only is a man of intelligence and of good advice, but he's also a man who has studied handwriting. So this is another reason why Utterson feels that he's able to show Guest the letter and get some really quite good advice for it in terms of how Utterson should shape his future course. In other words, in terms of what he should do next. "This is a sad business about Sir Danvers," he said. "Yes, sir, indeed," replied Guest. "It has elicited a great deal of public feeling. The man, of course, was mad." The man that they talk about here, of course, is the murderer, the killer, Edward Hyde. "I should like to hear your views on that," replied Utterson. "I have a document here in his handwriting. It is between ourselves, for I scarce know what to do about it. It's an ugly business at the best, but there it is, quite in your way, a murderer's autograph." So for somebody that studies handwriting, this will be really quite an exciting opportunity to actually have the handwriting of this murderer, Mr. Hyde, in front of him for him to look at. Guest's eyes brightened, and he sat down at once and studied it with passion. "No, sir," he said, "not mad, but it is an odd hand." "And by all accounts a very odd writer," added the lawyer. Just then the servant entered with a note. So the first thing that Utterson believes is that the person that wrote the letter, Edward Hyde, as he believes, must be mad. But Guest's first response is that he's not mad, but there is something odd, there is something unusual about the handwriting. Just then the servant entered with a note. "Is that from Dr. Jekyll, sir?" inquired the clerk. "I thought I knew the writing. Anything private, Mr. Utterson?" "Only an invitation to dinner." "Why, do you want to see it?" "One moment, I thank you, sir." And the clerk laid the 2 sheets of paper alongside and sedulously compared their contents. Sedulously just means very carefully. So he's got the letter that was apparently written from Edward Hyde to Dr. Jekyll in front of him. And then the second thing that he has in front of him is a note that has just been brought from Utterson's servant, and it's a letter from Dr. Jekyll inviting Utterson to dinner. So what Guest does is he puts the two of them, the 2 letters, the one that's apparently from Hyde and the one that's from Dr. Jekyll, he puts them down side by side and studies them very carefully. "Thank you, sir," Guest said at last, returning both. "It's a very interesting autograph." There was a pause, during which Mr. Utterson struggled with himself. "Why did you compare them, Guest?" he inquired suddenly. "Well, sir," returned the lawyer, "there's a rather singular resemblance. The 2 hands are in many points identical, only differently sloped." "Rather quaint," said Utterson. "It is, as you say, rather quaint," returned Guest. "I wouldn't speak of this note, you know," said the master. "No, sir," said the clerk. "I understand." But no sooner was Mr. Utterson alone that night than he locked the note into his safe, where it reposed from that time forward. Repose means to hide. What, he thought, Henry Jekyll forged for a murderer, and his blood ran cold in his veins. So what Guest notices is that they are not the handwriting of 2 different people. They are the handwriting of the same person, but sloped in different directions. Okay, and of course Utterson has no reason to suspect that Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde are the same person. This would be just beyond the realms of imagination. We only know this as a modern reader. But what the conclusion that Mr. Utterson draws at the end of the chapter is that Henry Jekyll has forged the letter supposedly from Edward Hyde. So he's written it for him. And of course, this draws Dr. Jekyll back into the mystery, especially given that Edward Hyde now is a murderer. And once again, we see Utterson leave the chapter with his blood ran cold in his veins. So just when he believes that things will perhaps calm down, that Edward Hyde won't be seen again, he's got this letter that reassures him, that reassures Dr. Jekyll that Edward Hyde won't ever return. But then at the end, when he realises that, well, he believes that the letter from Edward Hyde was written by Dr. Jekyll, it was a forgery. And it draws the whole, all of the events right back to where they were, and leaves Utterson on the end of the chapter in a very, very high state of alert and concern once again. Not just concerned for Dr. Jekyll's welfare, but also perhaps concerned that Dr. Jekyll, his friend, has been drawn into something really quite dangerous. In this case, perhaps the murder of Danvers Carew.